even put a note on my desktop to do that. Anyway, okay, so this idea of every single party that's involved in this process, in this learning process, is responsible for each of these presences. So one specific presence doesn't rest solely on, let's say, the instructor. Everyone is supposed to take part in this. And, you know, as Ashley mentioned, there's kind of two phases that this can occur. So in the design phase as well as in the facilitation phase.
So as Kim mentioned, there are three different sort of interacting elements with this community of inquiry model when thinking about putting it in or using it in an online course. So there's, excuse me, social presence, which is basically the degree to which students are engaging with each other in the course. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, building those relationships with other people, feeling the presence of other people in that course and feeling like you belong with them. Then there's cognitive presence, which is students engaging with ideas in the course, and then teaching presence, students interacting with the course design and the instructor. So all three of these have to be present for a successful implementation of this model. And there's different ways to do this, which we'll get into a little bit later. But remember kind of these three different things as we move forward. So the social presence, we're gonna get the students being able to feel like they're part of the course. Like I said, they're able to project their identities and bring their identities to that course, whether it's through coursework or in interactions with others, maybe doing group work or doing some sort of discussion board or a group project, and they're building those human connections. The cognitive presence can also be done in different ways. You can have students engage with ideas individually, perhaps by doing reflections or just through simple engagement within the course. You can also have students do, build cognitive presence with students in groups or with others. So that would be things like the types of discourse and discussions you guys are having. It could be in the feedback that you give to students or maybe have them give to each other as part of the course design. And then teaching presence, you are of course still one of the most important people in the course. That does not change in an online setting. What you choose to do through your pre-course actions in terms of thinking about the design and the setup of the course are important. And then also the facilitation of that online course and the different choices you make while the course is running and underway are really vital to this community of inquiry model concept. And so the three of these really are all working together all of the time. And so here we have a sort of visual set up, really kind of focusing on the idea of how important it is that all three of these elements, the social, the cognitive, and the teaching, all of these presences work together to create a really good online learning experience for your students. When all three are planned and utilized well by you, the instructor, the research suggests that there will be positive impacts on student learning. So I don't know if Kim, if you wanted to go into that a little bit. We talked about it this morning.
Yeah, so these things, in order to have an effective and enriching educational experience, the community of inquiry model posits that all three of these presences have to be together. And so you can see that, setting the climate, we talk a lot about having like a safe space, we talked about that at the beginning of our workshop, but having an open and supportive environment to help encourage self-efficacy, that exists in the teaching presence and the social presence middle bubble there. And then supporting discourse, Ashley already talked a lot about that as well. But then the teaching presence and cognitive presence, you have to make decisions about, distilling this vast body of knowledge that you're an expert in the field in. And so you have to select the content. So it's not only, you're making decisions here, but you're also having to kind of make cognitive, intellectual decisions about, okay, this is what I want my students to interact with here. So all of these pieces together is what we're looking for. That's what we're going to talk about today. And there's a very large body of research that's been done on the community of inquiry model as well. So this community of inquiry model is, like I said, it's relatively new. However, it has been tested for validity several times. There's a lot of studies that have been done that have shown promising results for the classroom, the online space, not only for the kind of remote asynchronous option, but also for the synchronous option. So we put these two quotes here specifically because we think that they're really important for the implications here. So, you know, we heard from faculty that some of the things that they were really concerned about was, I just don't feel connected to my students. So there's this model that we have now at our disposal that we can use to start creating experiences for our students now, so that we can start to construct spaces where all three of these presences can interact. So the students in one study, and these have been replicated, we just liked these quotes, but in one study, the students who had higher levels of perceived social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence had higher course scores. They did better in the course. They also perceived that they learned more in the course, which also was associated with an increase in course scores. So I think sometimes when we talk about perceived learning, it's mainly just lives in that space. There's no implications necessarily for an increase in kind of, I don't want to say evidence. There's so much evidence of learning in a course, but the points. And so this is really interesting to see that this model does have an effect on kind of the grades that students get. It's also really interesting that the teaching and social presence have a significant perceived influence on cognitive presence, and that teaching presence is perceived to influence social presence. This is just bringing into focus that the teaching, the instructor part of this is really important. We don't want to, you know, in this collaborative constructivist model, we don't want to remove you completely from the equation. This is really what this is talking about here. So if we can carefully design these classes now, then we can move forward and we can, you know, use this information to our benefit here so that we can have great experiences, not only for our students, but for us too, to have lively discussions that can replicate what we feel in the in-person class, but have been designed from the very beginning as online courses. Ashley and I talk all the time that what happened in the spring, you know, this faculty survey that was sent out by CTRL, a lot of faculty felt that the learning outcomes weren't really achieved to their satisfaction, partly because we had to make a switch. You know, we had to switch, whatever the in-person plan was had to go online. Now is the opportunity and now is the time to start thinking about these things that will live in the online space and then move forward that way with the design and the facilitation of it. I also wanted to mention too here that the research, I didn't include it, I just think this is like a nice feel-good moment for me, is that students in blended learning courses had higher perceived satisfaction than purely asynchronous online courses. So we are moving with this blended learning model. So it's nice to hear that research is supporting the model that we're taking and that it is an efficacious model that we're moving forward with as a university. Okay, so we've been talking about kind of the theory here, and now we're going to talk about the practical application of this. But before we move on, does anyone have any questions? I can see in the chat here that people are asking questions. Oh, Ashley responded. Does anyone want to, you know, raise their hand and ask a question here? If you weren't comfortable with silence in the in-person classroom, the online silence is really intense. Okay, so let's see. So Gregory asked if there's a way to get introverts to communicate online. It's interesting because In the in-person model, we don't necessarily have a way to solicit feedback or force anyone in a comfortable way to participate. In the online kind of remote instruction space, we have an opportunity before us that doesn't exist in an in-person one, which is you can hear from every single student. So with a discussion board, everyone has to participate. And things that often make students feel uncomfortable about speaking up in person, things like, well, I don't want to sound dumb, and I don't feel like I can process quickly enough, I don't feel like I can keep up. These are now things that they have at their disposal. They have time, they are able to kind of reflect, they can go back, they can edit things, they can rethink things. So this is something that's really important and really amazing about this blended learning model that we're going to be using. And then there's a question about the recording. Yes, the recording will be available. Sorry, we started a little bit late. Our bad. This is our first workshop for summer 2020. We're getting back into it. We can also, I think, Ashley, I'm fine sharing the slides. We've got some notes in the bottom. Yeah, so we can share the slides as well. Okay. Awesome. So Ashley and I now, so we've talked about the theory, we're going to talk about the practical applications here. What does it mean to build a community of inquiry model for our online courses this coming semester? So all of these kind of strategies that we've pulled are from the different research that we've looked at here. At the end of this PowerPoint, we have some sources. It's a pretty long sources list, so we can kind of walk through those too. And Ashley and I have a lot of experience with a lot of these different mechanisms, both the pre-course design strategies as well as the facilitation strategies. We're facilitating right now a synchronous session. We do it quite a bit now. This is kind of what we do at this moment, but we also have an online instructor course where we try to build this community of inquiry model in. So, you know, we've got some you know, evidence-based practices that also are supported by our anecdotal evidence as well.
All right. So yeah, so basically, as Kim said, we're going to get started talking about all of these different things. And then we're going to start out first with course design strategies. So things that you can do that in the kind of pre-planning part of your course prep to later then build in social presence through this community of inquiry sort of model. So some things to think about ahead of time as you're going through and designing how you want your course to be is the first thing we've got here on this slide is the structure of the course. So it's really important to think about how you're going to organize your course in terms of some way that would make sense to both you and to your students. So I don't know if you've ever taken another online class before, or maybe you have, I used to work with other people's data sets in grad school, and sometimes you come into this thing and you're looking around and someone else's style of organization is totally different than how you would have done it, right? And so that's going to be there for your students as well. They're going to have to come into the course and figure out what's going on here for every course that they have. And you want to kind of limit the time and the cognitive resources that they have to spend doing that when they first come into your course. So think about a way to organize the structure of the course that is very clear, very consistent, and that seems to make sense with in terms of how you're going to structure the content of the course as well. You want to think about experiences that allow for student interaction and shared responsibility. So not only thinking about maybe having synchronous discussions or asynchronous discussions on a discussion board, but also giving students chances to sort of be in charge of those experiences as well. So somebody was asking about getting introverts involved in synchronous discussion sessions. One great way to do that is to make them the leader of the discussion for that week, or maybe even just for a part of it, right? So maybe the full kind of session is too much, but have them be responsible for leading off the discussion, for thinking of some good discussion questions for the group. You know, give them that time to kind of plan ahead, and then own that day of that task that they're going to be asked to do. An introductory video is a great way to increase your teacher presence in the course and also add some social presence, because if you put a video in of you speaking to them, they get to see you, they get to see what you look like, they get to hear your voice, and you can also use this as an opportunity to share some fun information about yourself. So it doesn't all just have to be sort of, this is the course, here's who I am, here's my email. You can share a little bit about yourself. What are your hobbies? What do you like to do? What did you study? Like, what is your research area? You know, these sorts of things that help you feel to them like a human. Oh, and the instructor information too. I kind of blurred those two together, but same thing goes for that bullet point. And then a good welcome letter or announcement is a great way to start off on a good foot with your students. Kind of introduce yourself, introduce the course, get them feeling excited. So share your enthusiasm with them, and then really make them feel like this is a good, relaxed, calm setting for them to be in.
The important part here too is when you are working through your design, obviously looking at the learning outcomes that you have and the assessments that you have, those are important as well when considering this. Looking at any kind of mechanism that encourages interaction and ownership by students. Those are the kind of the basis of a collaborative constructivist model here, is that students feel like they are also part of the learning process. We mentioned earlier that no one party should be the sole owner of a specific process here. Keep that in mind when you're designing experiences too.
So the next bit here is we're going to talk some about facilitation strategies as well. And I see we've got some questions popping up in the chat box about synchronous and asynchronous methods and which to choose. So which to choose is kind of up to you, but we're going to share some different strategies or ideas to get you guys going, to then be pretty well informed to try to make those decisions for how you want to run your course. So here are some ideas for asynchronous facilitation methods that you can use in your course that will help increase those three different types of presence, so your social, cognitive, and teacher presence within your course. So the first is using online discussion boards. These are great for getting students to try to think about the content maybe ahead of a synchronous session. So you can use a combination of both of these. You can get them to maybe make a reflection, point out like their key takeaways that they think that they've found within the material, maybe do you know, a question, bring up a question or two they still have. All of these sorts of things can be a good idea to try to prep students then for a synchronous session. And for those who are students who are a little shyer, this can also help them come up with ideas and materials that they can then bring in. So for students who are maybe more outgoing, they might be fine just jumping in and talking about their thoughts. But for students who are a little shyer or need a little more support, this can help them kind of bring that information into a live session. You can also use them completely independently of live sessions as well. Asking really good questions that get them thinking about the content on different kind of skill levels, starting out a little easier and then asking them for more in-depth and more difficult skills to engage with the content can be a good way to keep the discussion boards engaging. For direct instruction in the place of a synchronous live session, you may choose to use lecture videos. So you can do online recordings, you can do lecture videos using Kaltura or other, you know, video creation software tools, just ways to bring your material to the students. VoiceThread is a new tool that we're going to have for, I believe, starting for the summer 2 session, but definitely for fall. And basically what VoiceThread is sort of a visual replacement of a discussion board. So it's a much more visual tool. You or the students can create lectures or share information, make presentations if that's a part of your course, using images, using documents, using slides. You can comment on the slides through audio, through video, or through written comments. And that goes for the person who's creating the original piece, as well as the other students who are going to comment on that. So all of those modalities are available for all types of commenting in VoiceThread. And what it does is it gives other students a chance to interact with something that has been created for them. So whether by another student or whether by you, the instructor, and they can kind of pinpoint the exact point where they want their comment to show up too, which is kind of cool. So it's not like a discussion board where here's the post and here's my comment, and it's not necessarily referenced back in terms of any kind of chronological order. So that's kind of cool about VoiceThread that you may want to think about using. Blogging is also a good idea if you've got a lot of students in your course and you want to try to get them reflecting on different aspects of the content and having an opportunity to engage with each other. Blogs can be a great choice depending on your instructional goals and your course content. And then also consider incorporating photos or videos of yourself and then asking the students to do the same. So not every student is always going to be 100% comfortable doing this. But what you can do if they don't want to show pictures of themselves is they can show pictures of things in their life. So maybe they show a picture of something they baked or a cat that they have in the house, you know, which would be their cat, but you know, something like this, reflecting maybe a hobby they like to do. Here's a picture of their bike at a place they went that was very cool. So allowing students to incorporate photos and videos of other things to share something about themselves and their interests and their, you know, identities can be a way to get around that if they're uncomfortable. I'm gonna go close the window real quick because they're mowing outside. Hold on.
So I think the challenges, we've thought a lot about the challenges that are present for the fall. I think that there are also many opportunities that exist here. We have the chance to create instruction that involves both of these components here. So really and truly creating a blended learning model that is supported by research as being very effective. And so, you know, looking at these kinds of tools, the VoiceThread is a really interesting tool. I wrote in the chat that it's my favorite. I'm not gonna lie, I think it's okay that I have a favorite tool. It really allows for a lot of interaction for students because you can have voice recordings as comments and you can have presentation and you can present that, and it also allows them to comment on each other as well. It's a really great tool to use in addition to the synchronous sessions that we'll all be having with our students. It's a nice opportunity to be able to kind of rethink the time that students spend outside of our classes as well within this kind of community of inquiry model.
All right. And then we also have suggestions for synchronous facilitation. One great thing to sort of keep students engaged and build that sort of social and cognitive presence within your classroom is to use collaborative tools with your students. So instead of, sometimes it can be a little hard when you have a whole group together at once to try to generate discussion, right? We've all experienced that. Zoom itself is built basically for one speaker at a time. That's what it was designed for. And so breaking your students into groups or having them break off from the larger group to do some sort of collaborative activity, whether that's in a breakout room or maybe you provide other tools for them. So here we have two ideas. Miro is a mind mapping tool that basically students can work at the same time. Sorry, that's my cat. I'm having some sound struggles over here today. So basically students can work together at the same time within a mind map and design visual kind of organization of what a particular idea looks like. So if they're working on a project, they can do that too. So they can draw out all of the different elements of the project and maybe what's going to be contained in each one, who's going to work on it, that sort of thing. You can also make use of Google apps. So there's, you know, stuff like Google Pages, Google, what do they call it? Google Docs, Google Sheets, different tools within Google that would allow students to work on something at the same time, and kind of give them a break from doing the online discussion with the larger group and get them working in smaller, closer groups with each other. Another strategy is to rely on students to contribute to the conversation. Again, a lot of questions coming up in the chat about how do I actually get this done? How do I actually really do this? It is challenging, especially if you have students who are shy, or students who maybe are unused to this format. So some different things that you can have, activities you can do to get students to collaborate more, to contribute more to a conversation, are to allow people who are shyer time to plan. People who are introverted tend to like time to be able to think out what they're going to say before they say it. And so a sort of really fast-paced, dynamic, moving online discussion is going to be difficult for people who are uncomfortable with that, because they don't want to interrupt and they might not have time to think out what they want to say. So any kind of tool or strategy you can use to give people time to plan out what they want to say. So maybe send out an agenda or an overview ahead of time. Maybe send out your discussion questions ahead of time. Maybe, as I said before, use an asynchronous discussion board to get people thinking about the readings or the content that you've shared. All of those things can help people get into that sort of mode to have at least one thing that they know they can say because they've thought about it. Breaking students up into smaller groups is also really useful. Making use of breakout rooms. That tends to go a little bit better, but I will say what you should make sure you do is make sure you have very set specific questions you want, and then use a deliverable as well. So give students something that they have to bring back and share with the larger group. Because if you don't, they can have a tendency to just sort of go into the group and sit on their phones or talk about something else or something like that. You want to make sure that there's something they have to do and give back to you when they're done. And then the last bullet point here, we have allowing students to explore authentic examples with you and with each other. So I don't know if Kim has anything to add.
No, we're going to be looking then at the tools specifically. There's a lot of questions about what specific tools we can use to bring everyone into the conversation. So the next slide has all those on them. So we've kind of started talking about these in the chat a little bit, and Ashley has two, but things like polls. Polls is a great way to get people to participate. So when we talk about participation, Ashley and I are expanding the idea of what participation traditionally means in a classroom. To me, my understanding of the traditional participation model is that students say something in class. And we want to try to expand that definition with, you know, the opportunity that we have to use all of these tools now. So things like polls, they're interacting with the content here. There's a couple of presences here. They are being asked to contribute to the conversation, so their cognitive presence is there. The teaching presence, they're interacting too with this design that you have. And it's really interesting too, there's an interesting kind of team dynamic that starts to emerge when you ask people polls. Ashley and I typically ask a very silly question of cake or pie, and people get really involved in this. And it's so silly, but it really does feel like there's a group within a group. They're trying to, you know, bring their social presence, their identity as a person, and you know, their preferences and what they like and what they don't like into the classroom. So it doesn't have to be kind of as flippant of an example or as like cake or pie, but there isn't, you know, asking students what they think of something is forcing them to kind of do a lot of different things with, you know, the content that they have. They're interacting with each other, things like that. Breakout groups. This is an amazing tool. breakout groups is, you've probably used it in the spring, but in Zoom and in Blackboard Collaborate, there is the ability or capability for you to push students into their own little like virtual room. We're going to do that at the end actually, so you can feel what that looks like and feels like. This is a really great way for students to feel like there's less eyes on them. Some students who feel a lot more uncomfortable to speak in front of a large group have the opportunity then to say, instead of participating in front of 31 people, they only have to do it in front of 3. This is a really good way to have like a community within a community. The chat function, you all are asking really great questions in the chat. I have no problem interacting with those at all. I think that they're a really great way for you to share and contribute and ask questions rather than just having to say something as well. Use that. If you have a TA that's helpful, talking about ownership, you can assign someone to answer the questions or to gather the questions from the chat. And then at the certain point in the class, you can say, okay, Maria, what are the questions that have emerged from the chat? And so you're giving students ownership there. They're being, involved in asking the questions, but there's also a specific student who's assigned to that. So they feel more committed to it here in this community here. Webcams, this is an interesting one. So webcams on the one hand do indeed make it feel like there is someone on the other side of that. Ashley and I feel very strongly about putting our video on when we are presenting because we think it's helpful for you to be able to see us. And my crazy hand movements, I'm sure, are very distracting, but I can't turn them off for the online space. Sorry about that. But so kind of the pros for doing webcams is, or requiring students to have webcams is, yes, you can see all of your students with Zoom. If we were to stop sharing, you'd be able to see all of the tiles. We'd be able to see everybody's video and see kind of what they're doing. That's a benefit here. The cons to this, though, is that Wi-Fi connectivity varies greatly from household to household. As does the environment that our students are interacting in. So I'm kind of worried that my internet is going to go out and I'm going to have to enter in again. That happened to me 2 minutes before this started, right? So, thinking about those things with the Wi-Fi, it takes a lot more bandwidth to have your video on and to be downloading and streaming other people's videos, something to consider there. Also privacy. If a student is not comfortable sharing what environment they're working in, then, a Zoom background is a really great idea. I heard of a professor who had their students customize a Zoom background. So it would be like funny, or they get to pick whatever one. And that was kind of part of the communal practice. So that was like the building thing. So everyone, if they had their video on, was required to have a background on. So if someone was uncomfortable with kind of showing their background, they had something that was personalized and was there already. So kind of pros and cons to weigh. Something that I think would be really valuable, and if you are considering that, I would encourage you to send a pre-course survey to your students asking about the confidence they have in their Wi-Fi capabilities, because they probably had a pretty good experience, or at least can experience what it felt like in the spring, with all of the devices that they have in their house. They can probably give you a pretty good a reading of what it's going to be. And if it just doesn't work from them, then at least you have that information and you can make an informed decision based upon the information that your students are giving you. If you get 19 out of 19 people saying that their Wi-Fi is amazing, give it a shot. And if it doesn't work, then reassess. A lot of online learning is flexibility as well. So if something doesn't work in terms of facilitation here, then just pivoting just a little bit. The asynchronous part also, you can have visuals on your students. So Ashley talked about having them choose pictures that are of themselves or things that represent themselves. The voice thread is a really interesting way to do that too. Do you have anything to add to that, Ashley?
I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay, the icebreakers. Oh, I forgot the icebreaker.
Did we not? Oh,
sorry. Yeah. So the icebreakers. So We've talked about introducing ourselves as the instructors and facilitators of the course. So we'd have an intro video and a little bit of information about ourselves. Likewise, asking your students to do that as well will help encourage them to start to form this identity that they have within this online space, within your specific course. Every single course that your our students are going to be experiencing are going to have different expectations, different environments, different content, obviously. So you know, creating this environment from the beginning will help to bring them and involve them into this community here.
And then I just saw in the chat box, somebody was asking about sort of the banter that happens before and after the class starts as being a big part of a face-to-face kind of relationship building in the class. And so something like an icebreaker can give you a space to sort of replicate that a little bit. You can ask something totally silly, like Kim and I's idea of cake or pie, but you can also ask something related to the day of the topic for the day. It can be either one, and so that if you ask something a little sillier, you can get the students kind of interacting with each other, building that social presence, and then hopefully doing some of that relationship building that you might do typically before class starts with them in the room.
Yeah, Benji said that he had success with this with 15-minute windows before a synchronous collaborate session. This is also a really good chance for all of your students to figure out if they need to make adjustments to anything too. So the 15 minutes, so if I'm a student and I'm entering a classroom, you know, sometimes they show up like a minute before class starts. This can help them kind of test things. Does the link work? Is it distracting that my kitchen's back there? Or is there not enough light, or is there too much light? So this is a nice way to interact with your students, but also to do a little bit of a technological test drive before each session. And it's okay if it gets awkward. The silences, as I said, in the online space seem to be so much more intense than the in-person silences because I'm not getting any social feedback here, but it's okay. I know that all of you are listening and processing and thinking about things. You know, it's a little bit of a mentality shift to go from receiving kind of that feedback to then all of a sudden hearing nothing but my own voice. Also, we highly encourage doggies and cats to participate as well. Students love dogs and love pets, and it's interesting to kind of, you know, a pet is part of your family, or at least my conception of pets is that they're part of your family. And so it just kind of it adds a little bit more to the narrative of your story as well. Like, I like animals too. This is Pickles. Pickles is great. Yeah.
All right, and then so the last bit that we want to talk about before sending you out to your breakout groups to kind of talk it out amongst yourselves is the impact of your presence in the classroom. So instructor activity, as we've said numerous times throughout this webinar, is really, really important. It's kind of that final piece that brings all of the other things together, and none of it would really work well without you. And so we wanted to share some ideas here for ways that you as the instructor can kind of set the tone, create a good relaxed setting for your students to interact in the online space, create kind of a welcoming environment for your students. So the first thing is we've got a suggestion to use frequent communication with your students. So this D'Alessio article, they looked at different aspects of instructor behavior in terms of facilitation as the class was running. And they found that when there were more interactions with the students via things like announcements or email, then fewer students failed. So they did, I think, I forget, maybe 4 years of multiple semesters of the same course with different instructors and who had different patterns of behavior with the students. And they found that in semesters with more announcements, at least once a week, kind of that communication with the students, fewer students dropped out and failed. So that's a really important thing. It may not seem like very important, but from the student's perspective, they want to have those sorts of check-ins from you and those sorts of reminders about, you know, what's coming up, or maybe even a recap of what we did last week that was really important or really interesting. Using students' names, again, a very small thing it seems like, but to students it's not. And so this study also found that in semesters where the instructor went out of their way to call out students and use their names, so when students felt like the instructor knew their name, fewer of them failed. And so that's really building that sort of instructor presence and that social presence, say, you know, kind of letting them know you see them and you see what they're doing, and not in a creepy way, but in a good way, you know, like maybe calling out in a weekly announcement saying, oh, this discussion we had last week, so-and-so had a really great point, and so talked about this, or this other student had a question about X. And so sort of bringing in those individual pieces and sort of showing your students that you're paying attention to what they're doing can really be valuable to them. And then also setting the tone, creating a risk-free environment. We hear about this a lot, even in face-to-face classes, is kind of making sure that students are okay with taking risks, so that they are encouraged to do so. They're encouraged to try something new. They're encouraged to speak out and say something that maybe is a little wacky, but they're tying it in together and showing their thought processes. And then the last one is being responsive to students. So in this study, they looked also at feedback times and found that students' perceptions were what was important here, of how quickly they were responded to, whether via email or some other method. So taking a look at students' questions, taking a look at those emails, it does not have to be quick, but you know, just making sure that they know you're there and you're listening and you're willing to help them out is very important to the students as well.
A way to do this too for creating a risk-free environment. So the guidelines that we provided at the beginning of this session, let me go back to them to read some of them. You can absolutely, any technique that we talk about here, or any technique that we use and you would like to use it as well, please use it. Anything that you want to repurpose for your own class, absolutely. So, you know, we talked about be generous with your knowledge and be respectful of others' knowledge, and know that this is a safe space. Setting the expectation from the beginning. So following, you know, creating an environment in the design that is open, that encourages all students to participate in the learning process here in this community of inquiry, and following through in the facilitation kind of guidelines that you follow as well. That's a really good model to use as well, or good strategy to use too.
All right. So the last bit then is we're going to split you guys out into breakout groups, kind of practicing what we preach a little bit. And so we would like you guys to think about these 3 questions in your groups. And we don't have a deliverable for you today because, you know, we think that you guys are a little bit more engaged and a little bit more proactive than some undergrads might be. But if we were doing this with a group of undergrads, we would also have some sort of deliverable for students to bring back and to share with us. So here are our 3 questions to think about. So the first is, what are you thinking about and discussing with others in your breakout room? What goals are you trying to achieve with your course? So what do you want to get done with your students this semester? What do you want them to learn? And then related to that, what are your needs for the course? And maybe if you know ahead of time your students' needs for the course. The second question relates to the techniques and strategies that we talked about today. Did any of them jump out at you that you'd like to try? Have you tried any of them before and maybe would like to share with the others in the group about what went really well with that strategy and maybe what was a bit of a challenge with that particular strategy? And then the third is thinking about which techniques or strategies that you think you might be able to try with your course, either maybe later in the summer session or in the fall, and then how do you think you might incorporate them? So basically 3 areas here, thinking about your goals for your course, any techniques that you've tried before, and then others that you think you might want to try. Does anybody have any questions about those 3 prompts?
There was a question from Benji about a specific number of students you recommend per breakout group. So we can give you an answer. Does anyone else have experience with using breakout groups, and what size do you think is effective?
I've usually tried to stick to 4 to 5 students, depending on the size of the class.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
And Mary, I see another hand raised as well.
I did a bunch of research on group work just in general last year. And it seemed to me like the research suggested that more than 6 is often a disaster. So I've had the most luck with 4, because then if somebody's not there, there's still enough. And 5, like, I don't know, when we had our 3rd child, you know, running a zone defense is hard. So I don't know, group sizes group sizes are really tricky, but I think 4 is, for me, has been optimal.
This is that magical moment in instructional design and educational research where both of them are, you know, our research and our anecdotal evidence align. It's so nice. Thank you for sharing, Mary.
Yeah, and then Anthony has his hand up as well. All right, maybe not. Okay, but yeah, I agree with the others. 4, 5 max seems to be a good size group. You can also do it in partner groups, you know, if you're maybe working with partners over the course of the semester that you have kind of a cohort set up with them, you can do that as well. But yeah.
I just realized that I had to have my mic on mute with my video off.
Go ahead.
Because I can't see the video, because I just saw nothing, so I didn't say anything. But yes, 3 to 5 is ideal, but all that, every single thing of the breakout group is going to require the pre-surveys, because you can't stick kids together who are on VPNs in China, which may not work at all, or the content they share will not work with you. So you have to find out the bandwidth of their connections and other things like that we're experiencing ourselves at home, or else they're not going to be able to even talk to each other.
That's something good to think about as well.
Any kind of challenges that you experience with the technology, your students will probably also be experiencing them too. Simply because they are younger does not mean that this comes easy to them, nor that they have access to all the tools that we would want them to, or we have at home as well.
Oh, and one other thing, which was mentioned somewhere else, another thing, but it's very true. Do not assume that because they are quote unquote kids or they're younger than you, that they actually know how to use this stuff, because a lot of them don't. They have no clue how to do even the most basic thing. And you're just sitting there like, wow, who's the Luddite now? So those instructional videos are very important, where you're walking through and you're literally showing yourself navigating from their perspective. They're very helpful.
Definitely, yeah.
So have you all heard of the digital natives myth? So it's a myth. There is no research or evidence that suggests that simply because of one's age, they are more technologically savvy. There's nothing that's happened. There's no rewiring of the brain. Simply because they were born in 2002 does not mean that they know how to use Blackboard Collaborate groups. They experience the same kind of learning process that we do when we are approaching technology. And that's a really good point, Anthony. You know, providing a lot of these how-to resources is really important. And I'd say 99.9% of all of these kind of tutorials and videos that you would need to provide to students already exist. There is a robust library of Blackboard videos and tutorials and tools that you can point students towards. So if they know how to use Blackboard Collaborate or polls, they feel really good. They don't have to look at it. But if they don't know, they don't have to admit to anybody that they are struggling. Yeah, Mary.
Oh, am I unmuted? I was just going to say that I had a colleague who instructed his students in a statistics class to save a file to their desktop, and a majority of students had no idea what that meant.
Yep.
Yeah. Never, one
It's
of
like
the, go ahead, Kim.
computers 101 kind of, you know, file saving, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always a good idea to just sort of never assume that they know how to do what you're asking them to do. There will be students who definitely know how to do it already, but by making that assumption, then you've got a good base to help those who don't.
I know that we're you know, we want to make sure that you have enough time. Another thing that you can do with the discussion board is you can create a discussion board that's like a water cooler for students. So if they have questions for each other, then they can answer those questions for each other. So, oh, what reading were we supposed to do? Or does anyone know how to use VoiceThread? Or how come I can't access this Miro board? And then other students can also chime in. So it can be less of a focus on the information coming from you, and it can be, you know, participatory in that, you know, other students can help as well. Richard, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one of the things that I used in the spring semester was I had, in terms of technology questions for the students, was I identified students who were proficient and I had students buddy up, and that helped.
That's great.
Yeah,
Yes.
great.
So the instruction doesn't necessarily always have to come from you. Exactly. And the support should be a communal endeavor as well. Awesome. That's great. Okay, so we're going to give you some time now to work in the breakout groups. I'm going to create these. Oh, they changed the view on it. That's so interesting. Okay. All right, I'm going to open them. There's going to be a little pop-up that says that you would like to move to the breakout group. If you are, you can send us messages still. If the people in your group are not there or not participating, just send us a message and we'll move you. Great. All right.
We're all just going to do this at each other for the whole rest of the time.